Tonight we will return to a subject that over the years we've discussed several times. Maybe we'll be able to shed a new light on it, which is the fact that Yitzchak and Rivka could give birth to two such different children, Yaakov and Esav. First, I point out the fact that Avram and Sarah had two different children, Yishmael and Yitzchak, is not really a kasha because they had different mothers. Whereas Yitzchak was a child of Avram and Sarah. Yishmael was a child of Avram and Hagar. And that could really account for the difference. But here, Yaakov and Esav share two parents. Both were children of Yaakov and Yitzchak and Rivka. How is it possible they turned out so different? It's interesting, Rabbi Tzadok HaKayin, in the Sefer Yisrael Kedoshim, when he asks the Kasha, points something else out. That it's not just that they had common parents, but they were actually twins. Now, why would this make a difference? So you can explain it in a secular way, you can explain it in a Kabbalistic way. In the secular way, is because position in the family makes a difference. An older child has a certain experience, a youngest child has a different experience, a middle child has a different experience. Are the parents younger, are the parents older? So if you had two children that were born a number of years apart, you could say that that may account for the difference. Now, the oldest child, the parents were younger, they were more engaged. The younger child, the parents were older, less involved. Maybe that will explain the difference. But here they're identical twins. They were born, I shouldn't say identical, they weren't identical, but they were twins. Al Pi Kabbalah, you can ask the question a different way, because Al Pi Kabbalah, the Kabbalah tell us, the Balatanya quotes it, that the kavanas of the parents, the thinking of the parents at the moment of conception, is a very, very important thing. So you could have a situation where in the one instance the parents had one set of kavanas, in the other situation a different set of kavanas. That would account for the difference. But here again, we're dealing with twins. That means that whatever they had in mind, they had in mind. So how is it possible the children should be so different? There are several approaches to this question. There's a Sifri in Parshas Bezoso Bracha, which says this. It says that Avram had two children, and the psilas, the imperfections, were sifted out. Then Yitzchak had two children, and again, the psilas, the imperfections, were sifted out. And Yaakov was mitaso shleima. His children were perfect. Which is the idea that every person is a mixture of good and bad. Hopefully, the good overpowers the bad, overwhelms the bad, but the bad is there. So, in order to produce the pristine Yaakov, there had to be a process of biur, process of sifting, of refinement. So first, the psilas that was in Avram was sifted out. He had two children. Yishmael took the psilas, the purified essence was passed down to Yitzchak, but there still was a little more psilas. So Yitzchak had two children. Esav took the psilas, and Yaakov was the totally refined product. As Rav Dessler writes that the Svarim HaKadoshim called this the Soid HaBirurim. This is the mystery of selection, purification, refinement, however you put it, and that's the process by which Yaakov Avinu emerged. So therefore, according to this approach, it's almost an inevitability, a necessity, that Yishmael turned out as he did, that Esav turned out as he did, in order to produce the refined end product, which is Yaakov Avinu. There's another approach, which is an often quoted idea that Rav Hirsch writes, which is that there was no inevitability. That the fact that Yaakov and Esav turned out as different as they did was a consequence of the fact that there was a failure in their upbringing. There was a failure in their chinuch. Because there's an ideal, as the pasuk says in Mishlei, Chanech lenar al pi darko. You have to train a child according to his way. Meaning the chinuch has to be consistent with his temperament, with his underlying nature. If the chinuch disregards the temperament of the child, then it's not going to be successful. Now, Yaakov and Esav were different children. There was no inevitability to one being a tzaddik and the other being a rasha. They both could have been great tzaddikim, but they were different temperamentally. And says Rav Hirsch, they were given a chinuch which was identical. They were put in the same classroom, they were given the same instruction, the same guidance, and that was wonderfully suited for Yaakov, but it was totally inappropriate for Esav. Accordingly, Esav went l'tar b'sra, he went off the derech, so to speak. So what Rav Hirsch is telling us is that this was not an inevitable thing. It could have been different, but there was a failing. There was a failing in their chinuch. I decided to look up Rav Hirsch's comment, and there are two things which I never noticed before about his comment. Number one, he says that Yitzchak was blameworthy for this. In other words, it wasn't just that they were given identical chinuch and it was a system failure, it was something that couldn't be avoided. In other words, Yitzchak was to blame. If Yitzchak would have been on top of the situation, he would have more carefully scrutinized the two children, he would have given them different upbringings, but he overlooked it. So Yitzchak is to blame. And the first writes that this is an illustration of the idea that he discusses elsewhere, that the Torah does not cover up the shortcomings even of the greatest. But as opposed to other biographers who may try to glorify their subject, the Torah is brutally honest, even when it speaks about the greatest of the people. The Avos, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Torah doesn't cover up for them. The Torah doesn't hide their faults. And this is an illustration of that, says Rav Hirsch. Yitzchak was to blame for this, and yet the Torah doesn't cover up. The Torah points it out, and the Torah doesn't hide the consequences of this error, this fault. But the more interesting thing that Rav Hirsch says is that this idea that the chinuch was inappropriate, he attributes to Chazal. He says this is based on a comment of Chazal on the pasuk Vayigdalu. It says Vayigdalu Hanarim, and everything he says, he claims, is not original. He says it's based on Chazal, the teachings of Chazal. Now, this is a little bit of a surprise, because I think most people aren't aware of a Mamre Chazal that seems to attribute blame to Yitzchak Avinu for giving Esav a faulty chinuch. And the first doesn't tell us where this Chazal is. So, we have to ask ourselves, what might the source be? Now, Rav Hirsch does not quote obscure sources as a rule. Because when he quotes Mamre Chazal, it is from the basic canon, from the Gemara, from the basic familiar Midrashim. And the truth is that the Medrash Rabbah, on this pasuk, Vayigdalu Hanaorim, that the young men grew up, and Esav became an Ish Tzayid, an Ish Sodeh, a hunter, a man of the field, and Yaakov was Ish Tam Yoshev Oholim. If anything, the Medrash seems to imply the exact opposite. Listen to what the Medrash says. Vayigdalu Hanaorim. Reb Levi says, Moshel lahadas v'tzvaynis. This is comparable to a myrtle and an itzvaynis. Shayu g'delim zeh al gabi zeh. They grew one on top of the other. Now, these are two different plants, two different species, hadas and itzvaynis. But in their immature state, they appear to be identical. You can't easily differentiate between the two. So they're growing together. Kivin she'igdilu v'yafrichu. But once they become fully grown and they blossom, zeh noising reicho v'zeh choichoi. This gives out its fragrance, that's the hadas, and this gives out its thorns, that's its vitus. So kach, so it is. Kol Yud Gimel Shana, the first 13 years of their lives, shneim holchem lebeis hasefer. They both went to school. Ushneim boyim beis hasefer. They both came home from school. You couldn't tell the difference. After that, after 13 years, This one went to the Beis Medrash to learn Torah, and this one, meaning Esav, went to the temples of Avodah Zarah. So if anything, you get the impression that until their 13th birthday, until the Vayigdalu HaNa'arim, until they grew, you could not tell them apart. So it's hard to understand what does Rav Hirsch see in this Medrash to give him the impression that there was a failure on the part of Yitzchak to differentiate. It seems that the Medrash says you can't tell the difference. But that's difficult to understand. Is that what the Medrash is saying? That a child under 13, you can't tell him apart from another child? I think our own experience tells us that the personality of a child, the temperament of a child, emerges at a much younger age. You don't have to wait till he's 13. Maybe at 13 he becomes a little more independent. But certainly you can differentiate between children at a much younger age. And furthermore, listen to how the Medrash goes on. It is Amar Eliezer. A person has to deal with his child, take care of his child until 13 years. Beyond that, you make a bracha, Baruch Shepetarani, Baruch Shem, I'm exempt, I'm no longer responsible for this child's sins and punishments. So it says here that the Chi of Chinuch is fundamentally until 13. After 13, the child is responsible for himself. I'll just mention the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Reish Chaf Hey, where the Shulchan Aruch brings this halacha that when the child turns bar mitzvah, you say the bracha Baruch Shepetarani. The Mishnah Berurah writes that even though at that point the father is exempt from chinuch, but there still is the mitzvah of Haicheach Te'echiach Asam Yisecha, which applies to all Jews. Because your own child is not an exception. There's a mitzvah to rebuke any Jew who you see doing something wrong. Certainly your children fall into that category too. So it doesn't mean that once they're 13, once the child is 13, the parent is off the hook. He certainly is responsible for his child in the same way that you're responsible for any other Jew. But the special obligation that a parent has to mechanech a child, that's only until 13. After 13, the child is on his own. There's a chiyuv teichacha, just like any Jew has to give teichacha, but chinuch is only until 13. So the problem is this. If the Medrash means to say that until a child is 13, you really can't tell what he's like. Meaning below that age, all children are the same. And beyond that age, there's no chiyuv chinuch anyway. So where did the pasuk tell us chanayich lenar al pi darko? Where does the pasuk tell us you educate a child according to his temperament? Below 13, you can't tell. Above 13, there's no chiyuv chinuch anyway. Because obviously, if there's a concept of chanayich lenar al pi darko, you have to be mechanech a child according to his temperament, and the chiyuv chinuch is until 13. It must be that below 13, it is possible to discern, to detect, to understand the underlying personality, temperament of the child, and to be mechanech accordingly. So what's going on over here? I think Rav Hirsch read the Medrash in a different way than is conventionally understood. I think he understood like this. You know, there are two aspects to the upbringing of a child. There's the chiyuv of Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah is book learning. The child is mechuyev to learn Torah. The father is mechuyev to teach him Torah. And nowadays, we do not discharge this obligation ourselves. We send our children to school. We send them to school. School, of course, is the proverbial stone bed, as we said many times. It's one size fits all, not a good thing. But when it comes to Talmud Torah, that's not so bad. Because, after all, there is only one Torah. So if every child learns the same Torah, that's a manageable situation. But Talmud Torah is only half the picture. There's another aspect, which is mitzvah of chinuch. Right? Chinuch is not explicitly written in the Torah, but it's a mitzvah from the Derech Suvim. Chanayich lenar al pi darko. Chinuch does not mean to teach Torah. Chinuch means to train a child in his ultimate life's path. That's the mitzvah of chinuch. It involves career, it involves hashkafa, it involves lifestyle, many different aspects. That's the mitzvah of chinuch. It's not just book learning. It's not just to know the mitzvahs of the Torah and the psukim. It's really to train the child for life. And Rashi explains the whole process of chinuch, when we refer to kelim of the Beis Hamikdash, is to set them on their path, to get them started, so to speak. Now here, temperament of the child is critical. We may all have one Torah, and it may be important that we all learn that one Torah. But certainly there's no one way of chinuch. There's no one lifestyle. There's no one hashkafa. There's no one career path. Here, of course, we have to deal with the individual characteristics of the child. And I would suggest that here, school provides a difficulty, creates a difficulty for effective chinuch. Because you send your child to school, and in school, because everyone's learning the same Torah, there's one curriculum, there's one classroom, there's one standard, the individuality of the child is suppressed to a certain extent. If the school has a uniform, it goes without saying. Everyone is dressed the same, everyone looks the same, there's a dress code, there's a provision for how the kids are groomed, they're engaged in the same activities, and at that point, it's not just that they're all learning the same Torah. To a certain extent, their individuality is suppressed. It becomes harder to identify what are the unique characteristics of this child in order to be mechanech. So that's what the Medrash is saying. Now, the hadas and the itzvaynis are two similar plants which are hard to separate. But that's the mashal. That's the illustration. What is the nimshal? The nimshal isn't that we're comparing children to those plants as if to say that a child under 13, you can't determine his uniqueness. The Medrash says the problem is that each one of them was going to the same Beis HaSefer. Kol Yud Gimel Shana, Shneim Halachim Beis HaSefer, Shneim Boim Beis HaSefer. They all went to school, they all came back from school. So they were in school. Because they were in school, that made it more difficult to be mechanech. And that was the problem. And this is a danger, by the way. We could end here and we will take home a valuable lesson, which is to understand that the imperative of Talmud Torah in school endangers and puts at risk the imperative of chinuch. Because when you put people in the same room, the same class, in the same setting, the same curriculum, the same schedule, and you suppress their individuality, you can't determine, well, how am I meant to be mechanech this child, and how am I meant to be mechanech this child? Comes the Medrash says like this. It's true you kids go to school, but im kol zeh, chayav adam, or tzarich adam lehitapel b'bnoi. A father has to deal with his son. This is not only before there were schools. This was after there were schools. There already are schools. For Talmud Torah, you send your kid to school. But don't take that to mean that you're exempt from chinuch. The school will handle the Talmud Torah half of it. But as a father, as a parent, you are mechuyev to deal with your own child, to mechanech him, to guide him, to direct him, to train him, to set him on his path. At 13, you can say, Baruch Sheptaranim Yosher Sholzeh. But you have to be aware that school puts everything at risk. Because when you send your child to school, since there is so much conformity and so much homogeneity, it may be that you can't even discern what your own kid is all about. So if you can't determine what he's all about, because he looks like everybody else, or he acts like everybody else, and he dresses like everybody else, so how are you going to be machanech l'nar al pi darko? So the answer is you have to be metapel. You have to deal with him, and you have to get to know him, and you have to understand him. Don't take anything for granted. Don't assume because he looks like that and dresses like that, that's what he really is. He may be very different. And that's the chiyuv chinuch until 13. At 13, then in a sense he's out of your hands. He's already an adult. Maybe nowadays it's a bit delayed. And then you can say, Baruch Sheptaranim Yosher Sholzeh. And the first says that the comparison to the hadas and the itzvaynis is a mashal, but don't misunderstand the mashal. It isn't just like those plants are so similar you can't detect the difference. Here, that's a mashal for this fact, that you can't detect the difference when you send them both to the same school. And that was the problem. Because Yitzchak sent Yaakov and Esav to the same school, they were in the same classroom, So the Talmud Torah might have been fine, but the chinuch suffered, and accordingly, when it was Vayitlu Hanarim, they went in very different ways. I think that may be how Rav Hirsch understood the Medrash. But I'll go upon him. The point of Rav Hirsch's approach is that there was no inevitability to Esav being a Rasha. Had he been given a proper chinuch, despite the fact that he had a basically different temperament, he would have been a tzaddik as well. That's a very serious problem. How does that fit with the nevuah that Rivka received before they were born? It says in the pasuk, that the children were agitated in her midst, and she went to get information. She went to Yeshiva Shem Va'ever, and she received a nevuah. Shnei goyim bevitnech, there are two nations in your womb, Shnei umim me'achi paredu, and so on and so forth. Two very, very different groups. And Chazal say that what was this Vayisro Tzitzu? That Rivka would pass by a Beis Medrash, and the child would try to escape. And she passed by a Beis of Zara, the child would try to escape. She didn't know. She thought, for all she knew, she has one child over there with a split personality. Right? The message was, no, you only have two children. And the Ramban explains that once she got the message, then it stopped. Because obviously, a fetus does not try to go to church or try to go to shul. This was a siman min hashamayim. This was a message to her. And therefore, as soon as she got the message, there was no need for any unusual symptoms. But the point is, if there's a nevuah, if there's a message, that Shnei Goyim B'Vitnech, you're going to give birth to two children that are totally different, one will be a tzaddik, one will be a rasha, that means there is an inevitability. So in what sense could you say that it didn't have to be that way? Really, it was a consequence of a fault in their chinuch and their upbringing, as Rav Hirsch says. There was a nevuah that preceded their birth, which said they're going to be very, very different. So how do you account for that? Now, the truth is this, that we're really talking about two different issues over here. And if you think that the question is not a question, maybe you've already stumbled across the answer. So just bear with me for a moment. There's a contradiction, a seeming contradiction in Gemaras. There's a Gemara Masechet Nida, which says that the Malach HaMamuna Alehei Roya, the angel which is in charge of conception, brings a tipor, brings a drop before the Ribono Shel Olam, and asks the Kadosh Baruch Hu, this drop, what type of child will it yield? Gibor or Chalash? Will it be strong or weak? Chacham or Tipish? Will it be wise? Will it be foolish? But the Gemara says, Tzadik v'Rasha like Amach. But the Malach does not ask the Kadosh Baruch Hu, will this drop result in a child who is a tzaddik or a child who is a rasha? Because that is not decreed. Hakol b'dei shemayim chutz miyiras shemayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for yiras Hashem, meaning the moral choices that we make, and that's subject to our free will. So everything else, your height and your hair color and your eye color and your IQ and your physical strength, all those things are nigzar min hashamayim. But whether you'll be a tzaddik or a rasha, that's not the creed. Akol b'dei shemaim chutz miyiras shemayim. That's the Gemara Maseches Nida. The Gemara Bava Basra says something slightly different. The Gemara Bava Basra says that Eov wanted to exempt the entire world min adin. Eov raised an argument that would exempt everyone from divine judgment. He said, Ribono Shel Olam says, Barasa shor, you created an axe, Parsaisav stukais, its hoofs are split. Barasa chamar, you created a donkey, Parsaisav klutais, its hoofs are fused, they're not split. That's how you made the world. You made the world that an axe has this type of hoof and a donkey has this type of hoof. Barasa tzadikim, barasa rishayim. You made some people tzadikim and you made some people rishayim. So no one's responsible. In the same way that you don't give credit to the axe for having split hoofs and you don't blame the donkey for having fused hoofs. So how can you credit the tzaddik for being a tzaddik and how can you blame the rasha for being a rasha? Barasa tzadikim, barasa rishayim. You made tzadikim, you made rishayim. Umi ma'akel ayadcha. And who can stop you? You can do whatever you want. Right? No one can stop you. It's not like, we can stop you from making me into a Rasha. They're trying to blame. Mi ma'akel ayadcha. So the Gemara says, so what did the friends answer back to Eve? What did the friends answer back to Eve? This was Eve's argument, but we know he had his three friends. What did they answer back? So we would have thought that they should answer that it's not true. It's not true. Just like the Gemara Nida says that the Malach HaMamon al Hayrayim doesn't ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will this tipa be a tzaddik or a rasha? Because that's not decided by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The friends answered, you're right. It's true. You're right. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu made tzaddikim, made rishayim. But he also made the Torah as a tavlin, as an antidote for the Yetzer Hara. So it's a little strange. And the Gemara Nida seems to say that it's not true that Hashem makes tzaddikim and rishayim. The Malach HaMamona al Hayrayim does not ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will this people be a tzaddik or be a rasha? Because that's not determined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Here it seems that the friends were saying, you're right. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does decree this person will be a tzaddik, this person will be a rasha. But there's an antidote. There's a Torah is a tavlin for the Yetzer Hara. How do you understand it? The truth is, this contradiction is one of the central questions that the Sefer Tanya is based on, to answer this question. And he answers this question. It's in several chapters. Between chapter 14 and chapter 27, he discusses the issue. But let me give you a little background. The Rambam in the Shemona Prakim devotes a chapter to discussing two types of people. One of them he calls the chassid. The chassid is a person who not only does the right thing, but he wants the right thing, meaning that his desires and his actions are in total harmony. His she'ifa, his yearning is for the truth and for what is proper, and he lives accordingly, and that is called the chassid. There is no tension, no conflict, no temptation. His life is smooth sailing. Halavai, we should all be in that category. Then there's another person he calls the Kaiveshes Yitzro, the person who controls his Yetzer Hara. This is a person who has tension, he has conflict, he has temptation, yet he always chooses the right thing. So when you compare the two, the Chassid and the Kaiveshes Yitzro, in terms of their actions, they're both identical. They both do the same mitzvahs and they both avoid the same aveiros. But in the case of the one, there is total harmony, and in the case of the other, there is frequently tension, conflict, and temptation. So the Rambam discusses several issues. One issue is, which is more esteemed in the eyes of the Ribono Shel Olam? The Chassid or the Kaiveshes Yitzro? It's a good question. Well, it's a chapter to this, the 6th chapter of the Shemona Prakim relates to this question, which is better? But if you read the Shemona Prakim carefully, and you think about it for a moment, the Rambam seems to be saying the following, that a person has within his own control, within his own bechira, to turn himself from a kovesh es yitzro into a chassid. Because bechira, free will, doesn't only extend to what we do, it also extends to what we are. Because we have the ability to remake ourselves, to recondition ourselves, to become different types of people, if we want to, if we're willing to engage in the process. So therefore, there's no such thing as the kovesh es yitzro who's condemned to be a kovesh es yitzro. If he works hard, he can refine his personality, change his temperament, and he can become a chassid. And the Rambam, by the way, takes the position that the chassid is superior to the kovesh es yitzro, and therefore it's not only something that he can do, it's something that he should do. But this is the sheet of the Rambam, that bechira not only applies to the acts I perform, it also applies to the type of person I am. I can change myself. I can temperamentally be a different type of person. Now the Baal Tanya talks about the same two types, but he gives them different names. And he bases this on a terminology which the Gemara uses. The Gemara says in one place that tzadikim yetzer atov shaiftan. Tzadikim are controlled by the yetzer tov. Rishoyim are controlled by the yetzer hara. Beinanim zeh v'zeh shaiftan. They're controlled by the yetzer tov and the yetzer hara, which the Baal Tanya takes to mean as follows: the tzaddik lives a life of no tension, no conflict. Because essentially all he has is the Yetzer Tov, the Yetzer Hara is obliterated, so therefore he has a life which is free of any tension, free of any conflict. The Rosh as well is the same thing. Right? The Rosh also has a life which is free of all tension and conflict. He has no Yetzer Tov at all. He has no conscience. He just follows his desire. So he also has a life which is very, very, very smooth. Now, we think that Rishayim must be terribly tormented. No, not at all. No, there are Rishayim who live a very, very happy, contented life. They just follow their desires, and they don't have what we would call conscience, the Yetzer Tov at all. Then you have the Beinoni. The Beinoni is the person who's conflicted. The Zev is Esav, he's controlled by both. It may be that in terms of his actions, he's a tzaddik gomer. But it comes with a struggle, it comes with a tension. Now the Gemara says that Rava said about himself that he's a Beinoni. So the question is, the great Rava was a Beinoni? What, 50-50? Half mitzvahs, half averos? How can that be? Says the Balatanya, no, chas v'sholom. Rava never meant to say that. Rava was a tzaddik gomer. He never did an avera, he never was mevatel a mitzvah. What he was saying is that I'm not on the madrega where I don't have a Yetzer Hara. I am also conflicted. Things come with difficulty. An avera, chas v'sholom. I never do an avera. Mevatel a mitzvah, never. Because he was a tzaddik gomer in that sense. But he held himself to be a Beinoni. He wasn't on that madrega of tzaddik where it was only Yetzer Tov Shofta. So it comes out that this terminology that the Rambam uses, the terminology of the Chassid versus the Kovish Yitzro, the Balatanya also uses when he uses the terminology tzaddik and Beinoni. What the Rambam calls Chassid, the Balatanya calls tzaddik, and what the Rambam calls Kovish Yitzro, the Balatanya calls Beinoni. Now the first section of the Tanya, you may know, is called Sefer Shel Beinonim. Sefer Shel Beinonim. That's the subtitle. Sefer Shel Beinonim. So you'd wonder, it's a very odd name for a Sefer of spiritual guidance. Because normally our Sfarim of spiritual guidance have names like Mesilas Yesharim, Archas Tzadikim, because they encourage us to higher and higher levels of piety. But a Sefer Shel Beinonim, a book of mediocrity, seems to be unlikely. But you have to understand that the Balatanya is using the term Beinoni in a very technical sense, meaning a tzaddik gomer who lives with conflict. And that's what the Tanya is all about. The Tanya is about living with conflict. It's not a sefer written for those tzaddikim gemurim who have no Yetzer Hara. It's written for those people that want to be tzaddikim gemurim in terms of their deeds, but they deal with the tensions of the conflict in the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. Now, one of the very, very interesting things that the Balatanya writes is a point which is at odds with the Rambam. He disagrees with the Rambam. The Balatanya writes in Perek Chav Zayin of the Tanya that the assumption of the Rambam, doesn't quote the Rambam, but the assumption that a person has the bechira to become a chassid, or as he calls it, a tzaddik, is not necessarily so. Some people may, but some people may not. It may be that the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, your mission in this world is to serve Hashem as a Beinoni, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Nothing you can do about it. You were created to be a Beinoni, and that's where you're meant to be. Why? We'll see in a few moments. But the Balatanya says this is the resolution of the contradiction between the two Gemaras. The Gemara indeed is correct. So, there is no person who, in terms of his deeds, is decreed to be a tzaddik or a rasha. Because your deeds are totally in your hands. You can do whatever you want to do. Hakol b'dei shemayim chutz mi'yirah shemayim. And therefore the Malach HaMamona al HaHeroyin asks all sorts of questions. Will this drop be strong? Will it be weak? Will it be smart? Have a high IQ? Will it be not so smart? Have a lower IQ? All those things are nigzer min hashemayim. What you will do in your life, that's not nigzer min hashemayim. That's not decreed. That's how kol b'dei shemayim chutz mi'yirah shemayim. But the Gemara in Bava Basra is saying something else. The Gemara in Bava Basra is saying that there are people that are born tzaddikim, meaning they are born without a Yetzer Hara. They are born with a pure desire for good, and therefore, of course, they will live accordingly. And there are people that are born Rishoyim, and the Baal HaTanya here says Rishoyim doesn't mean Mamash Rishoyim. It means Tzadikim Asher Magia Aleim Kamaisa HaRishoyim. That means that they have a Yetzer Hara. And when Esav said Barasa Tzadikim Barasa Rishoyim, it means there are people that have a Yetzer Hara, they were created that way, and they cannot do anything to change that. They are condemned to having a Yetzer Hara. And to that, Eve's friend said, 100% right. Yes, there are such people. That's true. There are such people that Barasa Tzadika Barasa Rishoyim, there are people that have to have a Yetzer Hara. But that doesn't mean they have to live like Rishoyim. Because Barasi Torah Tavlim. Because Torah is the antidote to that. So basically, says the Baal HaTanya, what the Gemara in Bava Basra is saying is that there's no person who is decreed Nigzer Min HaShemayim that he should perform the actions of a Rasha. But there are people upon whom there's a Gzera Shemayim that they should have a Yetzer Hara, which they cannot obliterate. They have to have this Yetzer Hara. So the question is, why does the Kadosh Baruch Hu do that to a person? Why does a person have that faith? So Baal HaTanya writes, and it's very, very beautiful words. I'm not going to read it because the hour is late, but if you look in Perek Chav Zayin, it's worth looking at. The Baal HaTanya says, because there are two different types of Nachas Ruach, two different types of satisfaction, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu derives from our service. Those tzaddikim, who love the Ribbon Shloim and love Torah and love mitzvahs and always want to do the right thing, that's a very special nachas ruach to the Ribbon Shloim, pure acts of avodah, untainted by temptation and desire. It's a very, very beautiful thing. But there's something else. With the avodah of a person who overcomes evil, who is tormented, who is tortured and seduced by the Yetzer Hara, and he rises above that, that's a special nachas ruach to the Ribbon Shloim, and maybe it's even a greater nachas ruach, that avodah, than the avodah of the tzaddik. And therefore, different people are given different missions. This person is given the mission, he has no Yetzer Hara, or he's given the ability to obliterate his Yetzer Hara, so that he can perform avodah which is pure and untainted, and give the Ribbon Shloim that type of nachas ruach. Then you have other people who are given this job, they're condemned to this job. Your job is to serve the Ribbon Shloim with a Yetzer Hara, because you give the Ribbon Shloim that other type of nachas ruach, which is the nachas ruach of kavishas hayetzer, of suppressing the yetzer, of overpowering evil, which is a very lofty thing. And once upon a time, I don't remember whether it was in this year or another year, we pointed out that the Derech Hashem says a very interesting thing. The Derech Hashem says that all evil in the universe has a common root. And therefore, whenever we overpower evil, there is a global effect. It weakens the very shorish of Ra, and therefore if the shorish of Ra is weakened, all the branches of Ra are equally weakened. And therefore the Derech Hashem says that the avodah of the person who overcomes evil has an effect which the avodah of the tzaddikim doesn't have. The tzaddikim do avodah. It's a very beautiful thing. It's pure, it's altruistic. But those people who have the Yetzer Hara and overpower it, they weaken Ra at the very root, and that has global consequences. So this avodah is very, very beloved to the Ribbon Shloim. I think the resolution to our dilemma about Esav and Yaakov is this. The nevuah that was given to Rivka is 100% true. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Rivka, you have two very different children temperamentally. Yaakov is going to be a person who is pure, he's ishtam, he's uncomplicated, he's not tormented, there's no inner conflict, he wants to do the right thing, he loves Ribbon Shloim, he loves Torah, he loves mitzvahs, he takes to it like a duck takes to water. It's a life of perfect harmony and consistency. That's Yaakov. You're going to have another child. This child will have the Yetzer Hara, he will be tormented, he'll be conflicted, and so on and so forth. These are two very different people. Two very different types. But that doesn't mean that the one who has the Yetzer Hara has to act like a Rosh. If he's given the right direction and the right chinuch, and he's willing to work, and he's willing to overcome the Yetzer Hara, he can be a tzaddik, and maybe he will give the Ribono Shel Olam more nachas ruach than the other. Now, there are svarim that say the following thing. I'll just say it. They say that if Esav would have acted properly, then maybe Esav would have been the founder of Klal Yisrael. Which at first glance sounds very difficult. But that's the idea. In other words, Baruch told Rivka, you're going to have two children who are different temperamentally. And maybe this is why she was given those children, because the Taka was not determined at the time of their birth which one would be the successor of Yitzchak. If Esav would have been successful in his Kvisha Hayetzer, maybe he would have been a more worthy founder of Klal Yisrael. Because the Nachas Ruach that Esav would have provided by suppressing the Yetzer Hara would have been a greater source of satisfaction and perhaps of greater global consequence. So in a sense it could be that Ribono Shel Olam covered his bets. He said, listen, I'm going to create such a person with the Yetzer Hara. Whether he can be the founder of Klal Yisrael will depend on how he acts and what he does. But there's a fallback. There will also be another child who is pure and uncomplicated and simple in that sense. So there'll be somebody to be the successor of Yitzchak. But who it will be is not determined yet. And it could have been Esav. So the Nevuah is true. Shnei goyim bevitnech. And let me tell you an interesting thing. The Netziv says a fantastic thing. And the pasuk, the Rav Ya'avod So'ir, that the older will work the younger. So he points out that in the Lashon HaKodesh, this is a very cryptic phrase. It's not clear which is the subject and which is the object. Is it V'Rav, the older one, will enslave the younger one, Rav Ya'avod So'ir, or is it V'Rav Ya'avod So'ir, that the older one will be enslaved by the younger one? Because in Lashon HaKodesh, word order changes. It's not always the subject before the verb and the object after the verb. It could be vice versa too. So the Netziv says that this Nebuah was cryptic. All Rivka knew was that she has two children, and one of them will be the successor, and the other will not. But which is which was not revealed to her at the time. Of course, as it unfolded, she understood which way it had to go. Because she knew the truth about Esav, that he was obviously disqualified. And therefore she understood that the Nevuah really meant that Yitzchak would be the master and Esav would be the slave. But at the time the Nevuah was said, it was equivocal. It could have been either way. And now the Chilukei Deis between Yitzchak and Rivka makes perfect sense. In other words, Yitzchak's position is of course, more coherent. If Esav is Taka Tzaddik, then of course he should be the founder of Klal Yisrael. Because the person who has that strength and that power to overcome evil, that's a greater source of Nachas Ruach. That's a greater source of Tikkun for the entire world. He says, why should I choose Yaakov? Yaakov is a good person. He said, Tzaddik Gomer. He's pure and uncomplicated. But what Esav can accomplish is more. Of course, Rivka, who knew the reality of Esav, understood that Esav obviously is written off, despite the fact that he might once upon a time have the greater potential. But Lamaisa, it has to be Yaakov. But what Yitzchak thought makes perfect sense. Now the question is this. The question is, why didn't it happen? So it comes there first and says it didn't happen because there was a fall in the chinuch of Esav. That's why it didn't happen. In other words, we ask the question, was there an inevitability as per the Nevuah, or was it something which just happened to happen because of the fall in chinuch? The answer is both are true. In other words, the fact that there was such a person that had this evil, there was an inevitability. And it's a very interesting thing when you think about it. There was a process of birur, there was a process of refinement. The Psailes and Yitzchak all went into Esav, and Yaakov remained pure. So therefore, Yaakov was in a sense the insurance policy. There'll always be a Yaakov. In the worst scenario, Yaakov can establish Klal Yisrael, but in the best scenario, it can be Esav. Because all that evil Esav will overpower, and that will be something which is even greater. It'll be mamish overcoming evil at the very root. It'll make tikkunim in the world that will be unbelievable. And that was Yitzchak's cheshbon, right? But what happened was that something happened. Something happened which didn't have to happen. Which was, as our verse says, there was a flaw in the chinuch of Esav. It wasn't chanayich l'nar al pi darko. And I would perhaps suggest that maybe this is the chinuch. You know, you have a good boy, so to speak. So how do you train him? Follow your heart. Follow your impulses. You know, you're so good-natured and good-hearted. Just follow your natural inclination, and you'll be successful. How are you mechanech the person who has temptation? You tell them you have to be firm and strong and resolute, and you have to overcome all the obstacles, and you have to fight with yourself and be a warrior, and so on and so forth. He gives it to the same chinuch. Of course, it's going to be perfect for Yaakov, a disaster for Esav. But whatever the flaw was, there was a flaw in the chinuch of Esav. Esav didn't become what he was meant to be, and accordingly, Klal Yisrael had to be established through Yaakov. This is something which Rivka understood. Yaakov Avinu thought Esav was a tzaddik. He says, what? But he didn't think that Yaakov was also a tzaddik? So of course he knew Yaakov was a tzaddik. But if you have a choice of establishing Klal Yisrael through a tzaddik who is a tzaddik without a Yetzer Hara, and establishing Klal Yisrael through a tzaddik who has the Yetzer Hara and overpowers evil, so of course in Yitzchak, that's the person you go with. So Mele Yitzchak's cheshbon is very good. Rivka knew the truth about Esav, and she said, obviously, it can't be Esav, it has to be Yaakov. But at least what the Havamim of Yitzchak is, makes a lot of sense. But this is the main Nakuda. The main Nakuda is, in a certain sense, there was an inevitability. There was an inevitability on the basis of the Nevuah that there would be two very different people emerging from Rivka. There would be one who would be pure and untainted. The other would be conflicted and tormented. That had to be. But did it have to be that he would act upon it? That didn't have to be. That Esav could have risen above that, and maybe he would have even been greater than Yaakov. But the chinuch, as the verse says, was a failure. According to that potential that was realized, and Klal Yisrael was founded from Yaakov.